Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Ches, Daf 78 of Pesachim. It's kind of a continuation of yesterday and the excitement of Tuma Hutra B'tzibor and Tuma Dechuya B'tzibor and all sorts of fun stuff. But it does end at the top of Amud Beis, kind of, so, well, to an extent. So, let's just kind of say that. And so we get to a new Mishnah on Ayin Ches Beis, to which discusses if the Korban Pesach becomes tamay, whether it's the meat that becomes tamay or the chaylev that becomes tamay. It has come up before in the past. We'll get into a little bit more detail today. Let us begin on Daf Ayin Ches. First of all, let me ask, how is everybody doing? Recovered from yesterday, right? Got a good night's sleep? You feeling okay? Ready for today? Good. Let's go weiter. We are in Daf Ayin Ches Aleph, all the way at the top. Last word of the first line. Lema masnisin tilok Reb Yossi. Now, we had spent a good chunk of yesterday trying to figure out if Reb Yoshua could jive with our Mishnah. Now we're trying to figure out if Reb Yossi could jive with our Mishnah. Let's see. The Tanya is, we learned a brayso that we learned yesterday. Reb Eliezer Omer says, Reb Eliezer atzitz maratza alachilos. Reb Yossi Omer eina atzitz maratza alachilos. So we saw a machlokes yesterday between Reb Eliezer and Reb Yossi, which is very interesting because different generations, right? It's not usually when we see Reb Eliezer, we see Reb Yoshua with him. It's interesting to see that Reb Yossi is arguing on Reb Eliezer, who is a Rebbe of his Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva. But nonetheless, we have machlokes between Reb Eliezer and Reb Yossi. Reb Eliezer says that the tzitz is miratzeh even for the achilos, even for the basar, for the meat, not just like the blood. And Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz is not miratzeh for the achilos. Okay, sounds good to me. Now, it enters your mind to say, so, from the fact that Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz is not miratzeh on the achilos, Rabbi Yoshua svirle, damer be'inan tarte. So he must hold like Rabbi Yoshua, who says that we need tarte. Remember yesterday we had a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, right? That do you need the meat of the korban to be tahor, to be pure, in order to be able to do zrikas hadam? So, for example, if we take in our Mishnah the zivchei shal mitzibor, which we were using for an example yesterday, so the korban, the communal shlamim offering. So let's say the meat of the offering is tamay, and therefore the kohanim would be unable to eat it. I'm assuming that it's the kohanim who eat the meat of the communal offerings. In general, a shlamim would be eaten by the owner, at least a lot of it. But over here in the communal offerings, we say that Rashi had pointed out that the only example of a communal shlamim offering is actually only on Shavuos with the Shtei Alechem. But anyways, I'm assuming that it's the kohanim who eat it. Now, therefore, let us say the meat of this korban shlamim is tamay. Can you still do the zrikas hadam for the korban? So the meat is tamay. Can you still do zrikas hadam? So Rabbi Eliezer says, sure, you can. Rabbi Yoshua's opinion is that no, you can't. Although we saw that he would say that B'tzibur Taka would be okay, but I was just using that as an example of a korban. But Rabbi Yoshua says b'yachid, because we said at the dafka, the last thing that we said yesterday was that Rabbi Yoshua would say that B'tzibur Tuma Hutra B'tzibur Tuma is permitted B'tzibur, therefore you don't have to worry b'chlal about whether or not the tzitz is miratzeh, because that's only if you say Tuma Dechuya he B'tzibur, but if you say Hutra, it's permitted, so you don't have to worry about Tuma b'chlal, so you don't have to worry about the tzitz being miratzeh. But if it was b'yachid, Rabbi Yoshua holds that you would need the meat to be tahor, as well as the in order to be able to do the zrikas hadam. Fine. Now, therefore, we want to say that according to Rabbi Yossi, if his opinion is that the tzitz is not miratzeh for the achilos, i.e., he's trying to. It's important enough for him to state his opinion. Right? He's saying the tzitz is not miratzeh for achilos. So clearly, achilos must make a difference whether or not the tzitz is miratzeh. Now, if you hold like Rabbi Eliezer in the machlokas between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, right, that Rabbi Eliezer says that, well, regardless of whether or not the basar, the meat, is tamay or tahor, you can do zrikas hadam nonetheless. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, who cares if the tzitz is miratzeh on achilos or not? The achilos are irrelevant. Even if the meat is tamay, you could still do the zrikas hadam. So from the fact that Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that the tzitz is not miratzeh on the basar, it must mean that it makes a difference whether or not the meat is tamay or tahor. And therefore, since Rabbi Yossi is saying that the tzitz is not miratzeh on the achilos, so it must mean that it matters whether or not the achilos are tamay, the basar is tamay or tahor, and therefore he must hold like the opinion who says that whether or not the meat is tamay or tahor matters, i.e. Rabbi Yoshua. Okay, so we're saying that Rabbi Yossi must hold like Rabbi Yoshua, that it matters, right, that in order to be able to do zrikas hadam, the basar, the meat, needs to be tahor. Now, Rabbi Yossi is saying that the tzitz is not miratzeh on the achilos, right, and therefore, if we go back to our case of the zivchei shal mitzibor, these communal shlamim offerings, just as an example from our Mishnah. Now, it's being brought bituma, right? The majority of Am Yisrael is tamay. They're bringing these korbanos. Now, if you're Rabbi Yossi, and we're assuming tuma dechuya hi b'tzibur, that when the majority of Am Yisrael is tamay, they're able to bring these offerings bituma, but it's not hutra b'tzibur. It's not that the tuma is non-existent; it disappears. Rather, it's that you're allowed to bring it betuma, and we'll rely upon the tzitz to clean up after us. So if Rabbi Yossi is saying, well, the tzitz is only going to be miratzeh on the dam, it's not going to be miratzeh on the achilos, on the basar, and he holds like Rabbi Yoshua, who says, well, in order to do zrikas hadam, the basar would have to be tahor, and Rabbi Yossi is saying that the basar would be tameh because the tzitz is not miratzeh. Well, then if the tzitz is not miratzeh and the basar is tameh, well, then you would be unable to do the zrikas hadam, and if you can't do the zrikas hadam, then there's no point in bringing the korban, in which case our Mishnah therefore must not be Rabbi Yossi. Got it? Good. So let's read it again. So let's say masnisin to look Rabbi Yossi, that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yossi. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Rabbi Eliezer omer tzitz miratzeh al achilos. Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is even miratzeh for achilos. Rabbi Yossi omer eina tzitz miratzeh al achilos. Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz will not be miratzeh on achilos, and therefore, if you have the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei, and they bring, let's say, theoretically, if they were to bring a zivchei shal mitzibor, so the tzitz would not be miratzeh for the meat, and therefore, kasakadaitech, we're assuming midik amar Rabbi Yossi and a tzitz miratzeh al achilos, that from the fact that Rabbi Yossi is saying that the tzitz is not miratzeh on achilos, i.e., that it matters whether or not the tzitz is miratzeh for the achilos, and Rabbi Yossi is saying that it's not miratzeh on the achilos. Rabbi Yoshua svirle, it must be that he holds like Rabbi Yoshua, the Amar Ba'inan Tarte, who says that you need the meat to be pure, tahor, in order to be able to do the zrikas hadam. And Neima Hashta masnisin to Rabbi Yossi. So let's say therefore that the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yossi, because since the tzitz is not miratzeh for the achilos, therefore the meat would be tamei, and if the meat is tamei, then you wouldn't do the zrikas hadam, and therefore there's no point in bringing the korban, and therefore our Mishnah, which says that you would bring the korban, is clearly not Rabbi Yossi. Lo. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Eliezer svirle, damar dama fal pisha ein basar. No, Rabbi Yossi taka holds like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you would do zrikas hadam even if there is the meat is tamei. Okay, so he does not hold like Rabbi Yeshua. He holds like the bar plugta of Rabbi Yeshua, the one who argues in Rabbi Yeshua in the machlokas, which is Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you can do the zrikas hadam even if the meat is tamei. Well, ihachi it's miratzeh al achilos. Well, if that's the case, then why does Rabbi Yossi even bother saying that the tzitz is not miratzeh for the achilos? Who cares if the tzitz is miratzeh al achilos? You could do the zrikas hadam anyways. So then the Gemara asks a brilliant question. Well, uletaimech, Rabbi Eliezer damar tzitz meratze, kevin da amar dam afal pisha ein basar, hatzitz meratze, afal pisha ein basar, hatzitz meratze, what? Uletaimech, Rabbi Eliezer damar tzitz meratze, kevin da amar dam afal pisha ein basar, hatzitz meratze al achilos, l'may ilchasa. Wow. Sorry, I was getting like someone like pinching me in my throat or something, and it totally messed me up. So I'm sorry I ruined the flow. But the Gemara says, but uletaimech, Rabbi Eliezer himself, Rabbi Eliezer says yesterday that, and also today, I mean, he said both of the, whatever. Rabbi Eliezer, whose opinion is that you do zrikas hadam even if the meat is tamay, and who also says in this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi that the tzitz is miratze on achilos. Who cares? If Rabbi Eliezer himself holds that you can do the zrikas hadam even if the meat is tameh, so why is he getting involved in the machlokas with Rabbi Yossi about whether or not the tzitz is miratze? Who gives a darn if the tzitz is miratze on the achilos? Achilos are irrelevant. You could do the zrikas hadam anyways. So clearly there must be something bigger over here. So rather, yes, both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Eliezer agree that you can do zrikas hadam even if the meat is tameh. What is the machlokas then between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi about whether or not the tzitz is miratza and achilos? Who cares? Well, there are nafkaminas in terms of pigul and me'ilah. Pigul has come up a few times recently. It is when you have a, while you do one of the avodas, whether the shchita, the kabbalah, the holacha, the zrika, and you have intention to eat the korban pesach, or to eat the korban, meaning it's a halacha by korbanos in general, outside of its allotted time, right? Every korban has a certain amount of time that you're able to eat it, and you have intention that you're going to eat this outside of its allotted time. That's what's called pigul, and you're chayiv kares. Now, we also mentioned recently that in order for you to be chayiv kares for pigul, that has to be the only problem with this korban, is that you had this intention to eat it outside of its proper time. If there are any other issues with the korban, well then you won't be chayiv kares for pigul. And therefore, the nafkamine of whether or not the tzitz is miratze on achilos is, well, if we say that tzitz is miratze, like Rabbi Eliezer, well then the meat is tahor, and if there are no other issues other than pigul, well then you'll be chayiv kares. According to Rabbi Yossi, who says that tzitz is not miratze on achilos, well then the meat is going to be tameh, and therefore in addition to having the issue of pigul, there's also the fact that the meat is tameh, and therefore you will not be chayiv kares for pigul, since there's an additional issue of the meat being tameh. That's one nafkamina. The other nafkamina was me'ilah. That, right, so when you're like makdish a korban, so then it is hektish. I believe that is what we are talking about. That, I learned me'ilah a while ago. But when I think it's saying that when you're makdish a korban, so then it's hektish, right? And if you get benefit from it, it's going to be, me'ilah, because you're getting benefit from hektish, right? And we saw that also recently with Hillel, that Hillel had this trick where he would only be makdish the korban right before the shchita, so that there was no issue of getting me'ilah up until that point. Anyways, so I'm going to work with that. I think that's correct. That basically you set aside an animal as a korban, it's now hektish. Now, you can't get benefit from it. At what point can you now get benefit from it? You can get benefit once there is the zrikas hadam. Once you throw the dam on the mizbeach, there's what's called a shas heter la kohanim. Now it's mutter the kohanim can eat the meat. At that point, it's no longer going to be me'ilah. Now, if the meat is tameh, well then the kohanim are not going to be able to eat the meat. And if they're not going to eat the meat, well then it remains me'ilah. Okay? So the nafkaminas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi about whether or not the tzitz is miratza and achilos has nothing to do with whether or not you could do zrikas hadam. They both say you could do zrikas hadam. It has to do with me'ilah and pigul. So let's see. So el lemikbay bepigul lafuke midei me'ilah k'mifligei. The machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi is regarding whether a korban is going to be considered pigul and you'll be chayiv karis, and whether doing zrikas adam is going to be motzi midei meila. Rabbi Eliezer savar miratze tzitzi lave. So Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is miratze on achilos, and therefore umashvele kitahor, and therefore the meat is tahor. V'kavale b'pigul, and if you had a machshava of eating the korban outside of its allotted time frame, so then you will be chayiv pigul because there are no other issues. Umapikle midei meila, and additionally, when you do zrikas adam, so the animal is now going to be able to be eaten by the kohanim, and it's no longer meila. Rabbi Yossi Savar, whereas Rabbi Yossi's opinion is lo meratze tzitzi lave. The tzitz is not meratze on nachilos, and therefore it's tamay. V'lo mashvile kitor. It does it right. The meat will not be considered tar. V'lo kavale b'pigul, and therefore, if you had a thought to eat the korban outside of its time frame, you will not be chayiv kares, since there's another issue with the korban, which is that the meat is tamay. And also when you do zrikas adam, it will remain me'ila, since there's no shas heter lakwanim. There's no point where it's mutter lakwanim, since the meat is still tamei. Those are the nafkaminas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi regarding whether or not the tzitz is meratze an achilos, but both agree that the zrikas adam would suffice. And if that's the case, so then we could theoretically argue that the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. What is Rabbi Yossi? And even though the tzitz is not meratze an achilos, you could still do the zrikas hadam, and that will be fine. Reb Mari asks a gevaldige question. Reb Mari asks the following question: Nihinami de Rabbi Yossi savar Rabbi Eliezer. Great. We just said that Rabbi Yossi holds like Rabbi Eliezer, and you can do zrikas hadam even if the meat is tamei. Fine. Now bishlam zvachim. Remember, in our Mishnah we gave 5 examples. Some of them were korbanos, some of them were menachos, some of them were shtei alechem. So he says, look, I'm with you regarding the animals. The meat, even if it remains tamei, you could do the zrikas hadam. Right, ikadam. Omer, when it comes to the korban omer, the mincha offering, nami ika kometz. So even if the shirayim, the parts that go to the kohanim remain tamei, but okay, there'll be the fistful that you throw on the mizbeach, according to Rabbi Yossi, that you could still throw that on the mizbeach. Lechem apanim nami ika bazichin, and with the lechem apanim, you could take the spoonfuls of frankincense, and you'll still put that on the mizbeach, even if the lechem apanim are tamei. Elashtei lechem ma'ika lemeimar. But don't forget, in the Mishnah, one of the 5 examples was the shtei alechem. Now, when it comes to shtei alechem, it's literally the translation of its name. 2 loaves of bread. That's all it is. It's 2 loaves of bread that I guess are eaten by the kohanim. Now, there isn't any sort of zrikas hadam equivalent. And therefore, if you're Rabbi Yossi, and you're saying that the tzitz is not meratze an achilos, well then, when it comes to the shtei alechem, the achilos is the only thing that there is. And if the tzitz is not meratze, well then the shtei alechem is tamei, and what's the point of offering them? V'chitemi l'karev imayin, and heiniu sham mitzibor. And if you're going to say, well, when it says the shtei alechem, it's not actually referring to the shtei alechem. The shtei alechem themselves are going to be tamei, but with the shtei alechem we bring the zivchei sham mitzibor that are also mentioned in the Mishnah. And the zivchei sham mitzibor, even if the meat remains tamei, you'll still be able to do the zrikas hadam for those. But if that's the case, then we only have 4 examples in the Mishnah, because the shtei alechem is really a reference to the zivchei sham mitzibor. But our Mishnah says explicitly that there are taka 5 examples. So therefore, we're going to run into a shtickle problem with Rabbi Yossi, because if he says that the tzitz is not meratze an achilos, well then, what's the point of listing shtei halechem in the Mishnah, if in fact the Mishnah could be according to Rabbi Yossi? So rather, it must be that Rabbi Yossi does not hold tuma dechuya hi betzibor, rather he holds tuma hutra betzibor. Therefore, if the tzibor is tamay, the majority of the tzibur is tamay, well then tuma is cancelled. And that is why you're allowed to offer all of these korbanos, including the shtei lechem, because tuma becomes irrelevant. And that is how he could be the author of our Mishnah. However, Ve'atanya, how could we say that Rabbi Yossi holds that tuma hutra b'tzibur? We have a brayso that says echad zeh v'echad zeh, whether this or that. What's this and what's that? It's referring to the Kohen Gadol for 7 days before Yom Kippur, and a Kohen. I don't think it's a Kohen Gadol. I think it's a Skan Kohen Gadol or something. But the Kohen who's going to be preparing Efer Para Aduma, the ashes of the parah, he's going to burn a Para Aduma and make Para Aduma water. So for the 7 days preceding, Kol Shiva Mazan Olav Kol Shiva Mikol Chatal Shayusham Divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir's opinion is that for the 7 days preceding Yom Kippur, or preceding the day that they're going to make more mechatos, so the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol, they would sprinkle on him the ashes of the Para Aduma mixed with water for, every single day for 7 days preceding, from all the Chatao Shayusham, from all the Efer Para Adumas that they had in the Beis HaMikdash at the time. And Rashi says something extremely interesting, which is She'efer Para Shel Moshe Lo Kalsa, that the Efer Para Aduma from Moshe Rabbeinu never ran out. I don't know exactly what that means, but it seems extremely interesting. Now, Rabbi Yossi Omer, whereas Rabbi Yossi's opinion is, Ein Mazin Olav El Shlishi V'Shvi Bilvad. Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that you wouldn't necessarily have to sprinkle every day. It would suffice to sprinkle on day 3 and day 7. Now, if it really enters your mind that Rabbi Yossi's opinion is Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur, that Tumah is completely permitted in the congregation, well then Lam Li'azah Klal. Why would Rabbi Yossi say that you would have to sprinkle anything on these Kohanim? They're doing communal stuff. If Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibur, so then they shouldn't have to have any kind of sprinkling. There's no issue of Tumah B'chlal. So the Machvarta must listen to Rabbi Yossi. Rather, it must be that Rabbi Yossi holds Tumah Techuya Hi B'Tzibur, and if he holds Tumah Techuya Hi B'Tzibur, and therefore we're going to have to rely upon the tzitz in order to make things right, and the tzitz is not Meratza according to Rabbi Yossi on Ochlin, well then the Mishnah cannot be like him, because the Mishnah mentions Shtei Alechem. The Shtei Alechem is only Ochlin, and if it's Tamay, what's the point of bringing it? It must be that our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yossi. Rav Papa says to Abaye, Rabbi Yossi shtar mizakeh levei trehu. I love this line. It's so great. Write it down, pull it out, show it to your friends. Party trick. Abaye says to Rabbi Yossi shtar mizakeh levei trehu, that what? No. What in the world did I just say? Rav Papa says to Abaye, remember yesterday we had a brisa from Rabbi Yossi. The brisa says that the halacha is both like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua by Zvachim and by Menachos. And I'm sure everybody was wondering, what in the world does that mean? We have machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yossi is saying that the halacha is both like Rabbi Eliezer and like Rabbi Yoshua. So Rav Papa says, Tabai, Rabbi Yossi shtar mizakeh levei trehu. What is he providing? A document that is vindicating. I think vindicating means like to me be like innocent. That is proving innocent both parties, right? Imagine you have two parties in court. One of them, I don't know, Reuven says that Shimon owes him $1 million, and then we could produce a shtar that says that both Reuven and Shimon are right. How could that be? If it's like, if Reuven owes Shimon $1 million or whatever it was, he does or he doesn't. How could they both be right? So how could Rabbi Yossi say that halacha is both like Rabbi Yoshua and like Rabbi Eliezer? Shtar mizakeh levei trehu. Is he providing a document that is saying that it's proving that they're both right, but they argue with each other? One of them's got to be right, one of them's got to be wrong. The Tanya is, we learn in the Brisa, Rabbi Yossi, we're just going to quote the Brisa from yesterday, Ra'ani as div Rabbi Eliezer b'zvachim, v'div Rabbi Yoshua b'zvachim. I hold like Rabbi Eliezer by zvachim, and I hold like Rabbi Yoshua by zvachim. V'div Rabbi Eliezer b'menachos, v'div Rabbi Yoshua b'menachos. I hold like Rabbi Eliezer by menachos and like Rabbi Yoshua b'menachos. How could you hold like both of them? And then he explains, div Rabbi Eliezer b'zvachim, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer by zvachim, by korbanos, shaya omer dam, afal pisha ein basar. And Rabbi Eliezer says that you could do zrikas adam even if the basar is tamay. Divrei Rabbi Yoshua b'zvachim, and I also like Rabbi Yoshua by zvachim. Shaya Omer, im ein dam ein basar, im ein basar ein dam. That if there is no blood, then you don't have any meat of the korban. And if the meat of the korban is tamay, then you don't do zrikas adam. Well, which one is it? If the meat of the korban is tamay, do you do zrika or not? Rabbi Yossi says that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer by menachos shaya omer kometz afapisha ein sham shirayim. Rabbi Eliezer says that you could throw the fistful of menachos onto the mizbeach even if the shirayim, the rest of the mincha, is tamay. And I also like Rabbi Yoshua by menachos shaya omer, that he said im ein sham shirayim ein kometz, that if there's no shirayim, then you don't put the kometz in the mizbeach. Im ein kometz in shirayim, and if there's no kometz, then there's no shirayim. So what's the deal? How can Rabbi Yossi hold like both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua? They're opposites. So Amar lei. So Rabbi Eliezer responds to Rabbi Papa, Mistarva ka Amar, that what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that it makes sense. What makes sense? That kikoi b'zvachim Amar. So when Rabbi Yossi was learning zvachim by Korbanis, he said, Mistarva kiechi de pligi b'zvachim pliginami b'menachos. That, well, just like Rabbi Eliezer is not actually saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer and that the halacha is like Rabbi Yoshua. What he's saying is that just like there's a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua here in Zvachim by Korbanis, well, so they also argue by menachos as well, flour offerings. Koi b'menachos, and when Rabbi Yossi was learning menachos, Omar, he said, Mistava kechi de pligi b'menachos, pligi nami b'zvachim. He said that, well, just like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua argue by menachos, they also argue by zvachim, by korbanis. Okay, that's what Abaye wants to say. Amalei, Rav Papa says to Abaye, Hatenach b'kai b'zvachim, amar mistava kechi de pligi b'zvachim, pligi nami b'menachos. So Rav Papa says, look, Abaye, I can understand why when he was learning zvachim, korbanis, he said, okay, just like there's a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua by korbanis, there's also machlokas, but it's the same machlokas, meaning that Rabbi Eliezer says that even if the meat is tamay, you could still do zrikas adam. Rabbi Yeshua says you cannot. So I understand why Rabbi Yossi would be saying that just like there's this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua by zvachim, there's also machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua by menachos. Diker krai kiksiva b'zvachim, because after all, the main psukim that we learned this out from, as we saw yesterday, from that so Rav Asiso L'secha Basar Ba'adam, that pasuk from which we learn it from, that's by zvachim. So I can understand how Rabbi Yossi could be saying that just like there's this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua in the context of zvachim, they also have the machlokas in the context of menachos. Right? They could cry kiksiva b'zvachim ksiva ella, but kikai b'menachos. But to say that Rabbi Yossi is saying that when he was in the context of menachos ve'amar, and he said mistavikechi de pligi b'menachos pliginami b'zvachim, that, well, just like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua argue in the context of menachos, they must also argue by zvachim. What in the world? Va'ikar cry b'zvachim u'dichsive. The main psukim are written by zvachim. Kilu, this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua really is by zvachim. The psukim are in the context of zvachim, so I can understand how Rabbi Yossi could say, look, just like they argue by zvachim, they also argue by mincha. But it doesn't make sense to say that just like they argue by menachos, maybe they also argue in the same way by zvachim. Zvachim is the main source where we learn it from. So then, how do we understand Rabbi Yossi? So Ella, lo kasha, rather says Rav Papa, it's no problem. Ra'ani is Rabbi Eliezer ben Nitma. So Rav Papa wants to explain Rabbi Yossi as saying that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that even if the basar, there's a problem with the basar, you could still do zrikas adam ben Nitma. So Rabbi Yossi is saying is that he agrees with Rabbi Eliezer by Nitma. So if the basar, if the meat is tamay, so you could still do zrikas adam. But what happens if the meat gets burnt entirely or the meat gets lost? V'div Rabbi Yoshua ba'avud v'saruf. But if the meat gets lost, or gets completely burnt, then Rabbi Yossi is saying that it'll hold like Rabbi Yoshua, that since the meat is completely gone, you would not do zrikas adam. Benitma my taima. But question, why would Rabbi Yossi say that by nitma that if the meat is tamay, he would hold like Rabbi Eliezer that you could do Zrikas Adam. Mishum de Miratze Tzitz, is it because the tzitz is Miratze on the meat? But we know that Rabbi Yossi says his opinion is that the tzitz is not Miratze al achilos. So why would he hold like Rabbi Eliezer that nonetheless you could do the Zrikas Adam? Okay. I mean, we had said earlier that his opinion is nonetheless that you'd still be able to do Zrikas Adam, but okay. Ella lokasha. So rather says the Gemara, it's no problem. Ra'ani is divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'tzibor. Okay, that Rabbi Yossi is saying that he agrees with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion b'tzibor. Ra'ani is divrei Rabbi Yoshua b'yachid. That when we're in the congregation, we'll hold like Rabbi Eliezer and say that even if there is an issue with the meat, you could still do the Zrikas Adam. But if it's an individual, then he holds like Rabbi Yoshua to say that if there's an issue with the meat, then you would not do Zrikas Adam. But B'tzibur my timer, Mishum Tetuma Hutra B'tzibur. Now, why would you hold like Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to B'tzibur that you would do Zrikas Adam even if there's an issue with even if the meat is tamay? Well, because of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, because he says that in a tzibur there's no problems of Tumah. Question number one is that we know that Rabbi Yossi holds that Tumah is Davka Dechuya B'tzibur, not Hutra B'tzibur. V'odem more so B'tzibur. And if we're talking about B'tzibur, Rabbi Eliezer Machshav Lo Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer would say that you could do Zrikas Adam. Rabbi Yoshua would say you're not. At the very top of Ayin Ches Amud Aleph, we said that Rabbi Yoshua would also agree that B'tzibur you would do Zrikas Adam because Rabbi Yoshua holds Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. Okay, so what's the deal? So why is Rabbi Yossi? Well, what's he saying that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer and like Rabbi Yoshua? What's the deal? Okay, so that suggests that what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer b'di'evet, that if you have a situation where there's an issue with the meat and you did the Zrikas Adam, okay, fine, b'seder, it'll work like Rabbi Eliezer, but l'chatchila, you should hold like Rabbi Yoshua, and if there's a problem with the meat, do not do Zrikas Adam. Okay. Di'evet, afilu Rabbi Yoshua nami modeu, but one second. But if we're talking about b'di'evet, so then even Rabbi Yoshua would admit, meaning, right, if we're talking about b'di'evet and we're talking about b'yachid, and we're saying b'di'evet, even Rabbi Yoshua would admit that if you did Zrikas Adam, it would work. Dekatani moder Rabbi Yoshua, shimzara kurza. So that Rabbi Yoshua said, in the context of Tumah, of meat that's tamay, that by a yachid, with meat that's tamay, he says that you should not do Zrikas Adam, but if you did, Rabbi Yoshua would say that it works. So what are we saying? That the halacha is davka like Rabbi Eliezer, but not like Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua would admit that, but the evidence it works. So ha b'tumah ha b'avad v'saruf. So the Gemara says, well, it depends if we're talking about b'tumah or b'avad v'saruf. Ki katani moder Rabbi Yoshua shem zara kurtza b'nitma. That when Rabbi Yoshua says that don't do the Zrikas Adam, but if you did do Zrikas Adam, it works b'di'evet, that's specifically by when the meat is tameh. Ava b'avad v'saruf lo. But if the meat got lost or completely burnt, Rabbi Yoshua would not say that it's kosher b'di'evet. So kikam Rabbi Yossi ra'anis divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'di'evet ba'avud v'sarf. And when Rabbi Yossi says that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer b'di'evet, he's talking about where the meat got lost or got burnt, where Rabbi Yoshua would not say that the Zrikas Adam works b'di'evet. But Rabbi Yossi is saying that he even by avud and saruf, he holds like Rabbi Eliezer that b'di'evet, if the meat got lost or burnt and you did Zrikas Adam, it would work nonetheless. That is how to explain Rabbi Yossi when he says that halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. He's saying that if you have meat of a yachid that gets lost or completely burnt. The Chatchila, he holds like Rabbi Yeshua that you should not do Zrikas Hadam. But b'di'evad, if you did do Zrikas Hadam, it would work like Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. Zak the new Mishnah nitma basa v'chelev kayim eino Zrikas Hadam. So when it comes to the Korban Pesach, if the meat becomes tamay, but the chelev, the part that goes on the mizbeach, is still tahor, so eino Zrikas Hadam. You do not do Zrikas Hadam by the Korban Pesach, because, as we know, the main thing by Korban Pesach is eating the Korban Pesach. And if the meat of the Korban Pesach becomes tamay, so then forget about it. If you're not going to be able to eat it, so then don't do Zrikas Hadam. Nitma chelev abaso kaim Zrikas Hadam. But if the chelev becomes tamay, but the meat is still tahor, so then do Zrikas Hadam, because you could still eat it. But this is not the case when it comes to other korbanos. When it comes to other korbanos, even in the case when the meat is tamay, but the fats are intact that you can put on the mizbeach, then you would still do Zrikas Hadam. Says the Gemara, Rav Gidol Amar Rav, says Rav Gidol in the name of Rav Imzorak Hurtza, that nonetheless, so if you did the Zrikas Hadam, so if you have the meat that is tamay, and therefore you can't eat it, and the Mishnah is suggesting that you do not do Zrikas Hadam. So what if you did do Zrikas Hadam? Says Rav Gidol in the name of Rav that it would work. But the Gemara says, but what about the fact that you need to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, and you can't eat this Korban Pesach? So the Gemara says, well, eating is not me'akev. You don't need to eat the Korban Pesach. What about the fact that the Mishnah says each person based on what he can eat? So apparently eating the Korban Pesach does seem to be important. The mitzvah. The Gemara says, no, that's just suggested. It's ideal. You really should eat it, but you don't have to eat it. With the akev lo, what, eating is not ma'akev? What, if you don't eat the Korban Pesach, it's still okay? But we learn in the Brisa, b'michsas. The pasuk says in the context of Korban Pesach, b'michsas. From which we learn out that the Korban Pesach specifically needs a group that is already subscribed, signed up for the Korban Pesach. This is a Gemara we've seen before. Is it possible that if you slaughtered a Korban Pesach for people who are not signed up for that particular Pesach, it will, okay, so you missed out on the mitzvah saseh, but it would still be kosher? Therefore it says, each person based on how much you can eat, tachosu. It says, right, b'michsas tachosu. It says tachosu twice. A reference to the group that needs to sign up for the Korban Pesach. HaKosuv shana all of the akev. That the pasuk is doubling up on this tachosu thing to say that, no, it's important that you have a group. V'eskash ochlin lemnuyav, meaning le'akev, meaning, and if you don't have a group, so then the Korban Pesach is going to be no good. And we compare, right, it says, ishtafi ochlo tachosu, we compare the achila to the group. And therefore, just like the group, it's ma'akev, you have to have a group, so also the eating is ma'akev. So, how could Rav say that even in a situation where the meat is tamay, b'di'evet, if you did a Zrikas Hadam, it would work? How could it work? You can't eat the Korban Pesach if it's tamay. And apparently, eating the Korban Pesach is important. It's ma'akev. So, Ella, Rav da Amar Reb Nosson to Amar Achilas Pesachim lo ma'akva. Rather, Rav holds like Reb Nosson, who says that eating the Korban Pesach is not ma'akev. He argues in the Chachamim, and he says that, Reb Nosson says that eating the Korban Pesach is not ma'akev. Hey Reb Nosson, where does Reb Nosson say that eating the Korban Pesach is not ma'akev? Ilemo ha Reb Nosson. If we're going to say it's the following Reb Nosson, the Tanyas, we learn in a Brisa, Reb Nosson Omer says Reb Nosson. How do I know that all of Am Yisrael can use one Korban Pesach? Mamish, all of Am Yisrael, the 12 million people who came into the Azar that year, theoretically all they needed was one Korban Pesach for all of them. Now, obviously, one little Korban Pesach is not going to suffice for 12 million people. Probably won't even suffice for, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 people. I don't know. Tamulom v'shachtu also kokal adas Yisrael beinu arbaim. Right? The pasuk says that they will all of Am Yisrael will slaughter the Korban Pesach in the afternoon. What, everybody is going to shech the Korban Pesach? V'alo ein shochet ela echad. There's only one person who shechs the Korban Pesach, or at least each Korban Pesach. What the pasuk is teaching us is that all of Am Yisrael could theoretically be Yotzei with one Korban Pesach. You could bring one Korban Pesach for everybody. And this was Reb Noson's opinion, right? Reb Noson Omer Minayin Shekol Yisrael Yotzim Pesach Echad. So we see that everybody, according to Reb Noson, all of Am Yisrael could be Yotzei with one Korban Pesach. Now, obviously, if it's only one Korban Pesach, not everybody's going to be able to eat. So therefore, we want to say that that's how we learn that according to Reb Noson, it's not an obligation to eat the Korban Pesach. But to which the Gemara suggests maybe that's not. Maybe you can't prove from there that Reb Noson's opinion is that not everybody needs to eat the Korban Pesach. That eating the Korban Pesach is not ma'akev. Because maybe I can make the argument over there that the reason why Reb Noson says that that's okay is because even though, yes, obviously if you bring one Korban Pesach for all of Am Yisrael, not everybody's going to be able to partake. However, each person on an individual level could theoretically be one of the people who will be able to partake. How many people could theoretically eat this Korban Pesach? Maybe 20 people can get a kazayas? I don't really know. But let's say 20 people. All of Am Yisrael, every single person could theoretically be one of those 20 people. And therefore, maybe because since, right, he says, Imam Shechihani Chazi Lahani v'Imam Shechihani Chazi Lahani, right, if these people decide that they're going to back away from the Korban Pesach, well then, the people next to them could take some. And if they back away, then the people next to them could take it, right? So therefore, theoretically, since any individual could be part of the ones who can eat it, so therefore, it's not necessarily a proof that he says that you mamish don't have to eat it at all. Or even be able to eat it, such as in our case where the Korban Pesach is mamish tamay and nobody's going to be able to eat it. So Ella Harib Noson, rather it's from the following Reb Noson. The Tanya is we learn in a brayso nimnu olav chabura achas. What if you have one group that signed up for a Korban Pesach, v'chazru v'nimnu olav chabura acheres? They basically double booked, right? There was a Korban Pesach, and one group signed up for it, and there was enough people in the group so that there would be no leftovers. And then another group signed up for the Korban Pesach as well. So Rishonim sheish lahem kazayis ochlin ufturim lasos pesach sheni. So we say, well, the first group that signed up for the Korban Pesach, so everyone will eat from the Korban Pesach, and they're yotzei for the Korban Pesach. They don't have to bring a Pesach sheni. Achronim, but the second group who signed up after the Korban Pesach was already completely accounted for by the first group, so she'ein lahem kazayis, that they don't have a kazayis of Korban Pesach to eat. Ein ochlin, so they obviously won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach. V'chayav lasos Pesach sheni, and they're going to have to do Pesach sheni. Reb Noson Omer says, Reb Noson, elu ve'elu p'turim milasos Pesach sheni. Both groups do not have to do Pesach sheni. They're yotzei with the Pesach rishon. Shekvar nizrak adam, because the zrikas adam already happened, and because the zrikas adam already happened, it works. And even though yes, not everybody's going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, it's fine. So we see that Reb Noson seems to be saying, even though not everybody's going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, they're yotzei, they don't have to bring a Pesach sheni. But the Gemara says, Akati do mashani osam timam shchihani chazi lahani. But can't you make the same argument over there that maybe the only reason why Reb Noson is saying that it works is because any individual could theoretically be one of the people who can eat from the Korban Pesach. You know, if one person says, backs away, so then the person next to him can get in. So it's not predetermined that any individual is going to be unable to eat the Pesach, as opposed to, which is different than our Mishnah, where it's mamish tamay, nobody's going to be able to eat it. So the Gemara answers, no. That's not the concern, because imkein lisnei hol v'ru'im limashech. Because Reb Noson gives his reason why he says that all of them are yotzei and none of them have to do the Pesach sheni. He says because the zrikas adam already happened. Right? Imkein lisnei hol v'ru'im limashech. If so, that the reason why none of them have to bring the Pesach sheni is because theoretically each one on an individual level could be part of the group that eats the Korban Pesach. Well, if that was the case, then it should say hol v'ru'im limashech. Then the brayso should say that the reason why nobody has to bring a Pesach sheni is because each person theoretically could be one of the ones who can eat from the Korban Pesach. But my shikvar nizak adam, why does Reb Noson Dafka say that they don't have to bring a Korban Pesach, they don't have to bring a Pesach sheni because the zrikas adam already happened? So clearly Reb Noson's opinion is that what's important is that the zrikas adam happened. As long as the Zrikas Adam happened, the whole group is Yotze, even if they're not going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, all of them, because there's just not enough. But as long as the Zrikas Adam happened, that's fine, even though Achil lo Ma'akva, even though they're not going to be able to all eat the Korban Pesach. So we see that Reb Noson's opinion is that not everybody needs to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, and therefore, even in our case in the Mishnah, where the Korban Pesach is tamay, b'di'evet, if you did Zrikas Adam, it works. My duchke d'Rav d'mukim la masnisin l'chatchila v'Reb Noson. How come Rav is deciding to say that the author of our Mishnah is Reb Noson? That when the Mishnah says that if the meat of the Korban Pesach is tamay, don't do Zrikas Adam, but if you did do Zrikas Adam, you're Yotze, and he's saying that the author of the Mishnah is Reb Noson. Nukma kra'abonon, v'afilu di'evet nami lo. Wouldn't it be easier for Rav to just say that the Mishnah is the rabbi's opinion, and when they say that a Korban Pesach that's tamay, do not do Zrikas Adam, it's according to the Chacham, and they're saying, don't do Zrikas Adam bichlal, and if you do Zrikas Adam, it does not work. So Rav Masnisan Kshise. So the Gemara says, well, because Rav had a problem with our Mishnah, with the wording of the Mishnah. Amai Tnan ein zorik es Adam. Why does the Mishnah say, do not do Zrikas Adam? Listen, apostle, say it's possible, right? Why does the Mishnah say that if you have a Korban Pesach that the meat became tamay, don't do Zrikas Adam? Say if you have a Korban Pesach that the meat became tamay, it's possible. Why does it sound like it's suggesting that you don't do the Zrikas Adam? So rather, what it must mean, what Rav wants to argue is that what the Mishnah is saying is that if the meat of the Korban Pesach becomes tamay, we're recommending that you don't do Zrikas Adam. But b'di'evet, if you did do Zrikas Adam, it would work, and that's why he says that the Mishnah is like Reb Noson, who says that eating is not ma'akev. Reb Noson, ish lefi ochlo lamali. Now, according to Reb Noson, who's saying that eating is not ma'akev, and even if you can't eat the Korban Pesach, it's okay, you could still be Yotzei. Well then, what does he do with ish lefi ochlo, where it says that you have to be able to eat the Korban Pesach? So the be'inan gavr the chazil achila. So Reb Noson explains that you need a person who's able to eat. For example, a zakin or a chola who are unable to bichlal eat the Korban Pesach. Well then they won't be. You can't. That would be considered shalola ochlav. But if you have a person who's able to, if the person is able to eat the Korban Pesach, then that's fine, even if the Pesach is, let's say, tamay, and practically he will be unable to eat it, but as long as he is a person who can eat it, he would be considered ochlav. Frekti Gemara, Mantana la detanu Rabbanan. Who is the author of the following brisa? Shachatu la'ochlav, shachatu la'ochlav, v'zaku damu shlo la'ochlav. What happens if you slaughter the Korban Pesach for those who are able to eat the Korban Pesach, but you did the Zrikas Adam for those who are unable to eat the Korban Pesach? So ha-Pesach atzmo kosher v'atzim yotzei bo yidei chovaso. So the Korban Pesach is kosher and a person can be yotzei his chova. Kamanu, is it like name Reb Noson, v'lo Rabbanan? So let's say that this is Reb Noson, right? Because we're saying that even though you do the Zrikas Adam shelo la'ochlav, we're still saying that the Korban Pesach is kosher. So let's say that it's Reb Noson. Afilu tem Rabbanan ein machshavas ochlin bezrikas. So the Gemara answers, no, you can even say that it's the rabbis, because they say that a machshavas ochlin bezrika, that when it comes to Zrikas Adam, you don't necessarily have to have intention for people who are able to eat it when it comes to Zrikas Adam. So you can even say it's the rabbis. Fine. Mantana la detanu Rabbanan, who's the author of the following brisa, harishaya chole b'shas shchita v'cholim b'shas zrika. What if you have a fellow who was sick at the time of the shchita, of the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach, but by the time the sprinkling, the throwing of the blood on the mizbeach came around, he was already healthy. Cholim b'shas shchita v'cholim b'shas zrika. What if it was the opposite? He was healthy when it came to the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach, but by the time the Zrikas Adam came around, he was no longer feeling well. Ein shochtim v'zarkin olav. We do not, slaughter or do the Zrikas Adam. We need him to be healthy for the shchita. We need him to be healthy for the zrika. If he's unhealthy for any stage of that, so then we would not do the korban. We would not slaughter or do zrikas adam. Kiman, who's that like? Neighbor Abanani, Velo Reb Nosson. Let's say that it's like the rabbis and not like Reb Nosson, right? Because we're saying that we dafka need to be able to eat it, right? We said that somebody who's sick is shelo la'ochla. And we're saying in this brisa that you have to mamish be healthy for the shchita, for the zrika. So clearly it's important that you be healthy, i.e., and that you be able to eat the korban pesach. So it sounds like it's like the rabbanan, not like Reb Nosson. So afilu tem Reb Nosson, you can even say it's Reb Nosson because gavir the chazi lachila. But we need a person who's fit to eat the korban pesach, even if he doesn't end up eating it. But he has to be fit to eat the korban pesach, and somebody who's sick is not fit to eat the korban pesach. Who is the author of the following brisa? Shochato betara b'acharkach nitmu abaylim. What happens if you slaughter a korban pesach and everybody's tahor, and then before the zrikas adam, the owners of the korban pesach became tamay? Yizarik adam betara ye'ochel basar betuma. So what you do is you do the zrikas adam betara. Right, you make sure that the dam remains tahor, and you do the zrikas adam, but do not eat the meat. So basically, we're saying that you won't be able to eat the meat of the korban pesach because the owners became tamay. However, you could still be yotzei, do the zrikas adam betara, and you could still be, the kohen who's tahor and he's going to throw it on the mizbeach. That's fine, and it'll still be yotzei his chiyuv korban pesach. He just don't eat the korban pesach because you're tamay now. Kiman. So Amr Belazar, b'machlokas shnuya Reb Nossani. So Belazar says, well, it's Reb Nosson. Reb Nosson says you don't have to eat the korban pesach, you could still be yotzei. So we're saying even though now you became tamei, so you won't eat the korban pesach, but at the time of shchita you was tahor. Let a kohen do the zrika on the mizbeach. You won't eat it that night, and you'll still be yotzei according to Reb Nosson. So Reb Belazar says that the brisa is Reb Nosson. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afilu teimu rabbanani." You can even say that the rabbis are the author of this brisa. Okay, but don't they say that you have to be able to eat the korban pesach? They have to eat the korban pesach. And here he's going to be tamei. He's not going to eat it. Here what we're talking about is bitzibor. So it's talking about where the congregation slaughtered their korban pesach, and then the congregation became tamei before the zrikas adam. You hear that? So between the slaughtering and the zrikas adam, the entire congregation became tamei. Ta'afilu b'tuma nami avdei, that they're even able to bring the korban pesach b'tuma. Yibitzibur amai ena basunecha b'tuma. Well, if it's bitzibur, then how come we're saying that you would not eat the korban pesach that night? If it's bitzibur, you're allowed to eat the korban pesach b'tuma. So gezerah. Well, that's just gezerah d'Rabbanan. Shema yitma bailim lachar zrika, because we're concerned that what happens if the next year the Am Yisrael, i.e. the tzibor, becomes tamei, but this time it's not before zrikas adam, it's after zrikas adam. V'yomer, they're going to say, well, ishtakid lo nitmenu ve'achalnu, and they're going to say, well, didn't something similar happen last year where everybody became tamei, and nonetheless we ate the korban pesach that night? Hashtanami neichel. So therefore, okay, well this year also, where everyone's tamei, so let's eat the korban pesach at night. But they're not going to know the ishtakid ki izdirek dam bailim tmeim havu hashta bailim torin havu. They're not going to realize that they're different. Meaning the first year everybody was tahor when they did the shechita, but then before the zrika, the entire congregation became tamei. So already by the time of zrika sadam, the entire congregation was already tamei, and that's why they were able to eat the korban pesach betuma. But in the next year, what happened was the entire congregation was tahor. They did the shechita, they did the zrika, and only after that they became tamei. But the korban was already offered, and in that case, they would be unable to eat the korban pesach that night. And therefore, if in the first case we allow them to eat the korban pesach, they might think that in the next, if the same thing happens the next year, but that time they all become tamei after the zrika, they might think that you could still eat the korban pesach, because after all, you ate the korban pesach last year when everybody was tamei. It's going to create a mess in this very specific case, which mistama never happened, and maybe it's one of those examples of something that never will happen, but Josh v'kabel sachar. But theoretically, you could argue that that's even the rabbis. Okay, fine. That was daf Ayin Ches of Masechta Pesachim, another kind of difficult daf, complex, detailed daf. We spent really the first half of the page understanding the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and trying to figure out two things. Number one, could Rabbi Yossi be the author of our Mishnah? We tried all sorts of things. In the end, we say, no, he cannot, because he's going to say, Tumah d'chuyehi b'tzibor, and he says that the tzitz is not meratzeh an achila, and if it's not meratzeh an achila, well then, how could he possibly say that you offer the shtei lechem b'tumah? But the tzitz is not meratzeh for achila, for the achilos, and therefore the shtei lechem, why even bother bringing it? It's tamay. So, from the fact that the Mishnah says that we do offer the shtei lechem b'tumah, so clearly Rabbi Yossi is not the author. We then discuss the brisa where Rabbi Yossi says that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer and like Rabbi Yoshua, to which Rav Papa says, Rabbi Yosef, he seems to be providing a document that supports both parties. And in the end we said that, well, what it means is that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer by a Korban Yachid that got lost or got burnt. So, l'chatchila he holds like Rabbi Yoshua that you shouldn't do Zrikas Adam. But b'diavad, if you did Zrikas Adam, you would say it's okay like Rabbi Eliezer. We then got to a new Mishnah, which says that if the meat of the Korban Pesach becomes tamay, even if the fats are tahor, you do not do Zrikas Adam, because the main thing of the Korban Pesach is eating it. Rav Gidl says the name of Rav. However, if you did do Zrikas Adam, it works b'diavad, like Reb Nosson. Very cool. That was Daf Ayin Ches. I hope you enjoyed. Get a good night's sleep again tonight. See you tomorrow. Peace.